This is the website, The Way, the Truth, and the Life. This is the contents, with an introductory video and 7 main parts. This is Part 1, the Foundation, with 34 sections. This is Part 1, Section 34, the Ability to Reason. Part 1, Section 34 is titled The Ability to Reason. It takes human development from when it was in the jungle without the ability of logical speech to the present time, and is intended to summarize the foundation that we have to reason on for the future. In Section 34, Part 1, the Garden of Eden, the snake, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, out of Eden about 2 million years ago, and infanticide. Those are the topics of that section. Garden of Eden is the origin of human life while it was still in a jungle environment. It came out of that jungle environment and developed what they call bipedal ability, walking on 2 legs, with an advent around 2 million years ago where there was a grassland. The weather changed to create what they call a savanna, a grassland. And in developing in this environment, the men had the responsibility for hunting and for safety. And we can trace human genetics back to essentially one tribe. There were not many survived this environment. Those that survived were those that could work together, and it also involved the attacking of other tribes to get their young women, because those tribes which inbred developed genetic weaknesses and destroyed the tribe. So one of the basic laws, I call them God's laws, they're the laws of nature, whether physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology, there are basic truths that exist, which I call God's laws. And one of the easiest no-brainers is the only thing that propagates is that which survives. So if there were nice people that were inbreeding, they didn't survive. If there were men, brutal, attacking, killing other men, and taking their women, and they propagated, then that's what survived. And it has a genetic effect after millions of years on both men and women. That's important to understand. To try and understand the behavior, it is what survived. And men developed logic. The women, when they came out of the jungle, the great apes have 96% of the DNA that humans have. And they care for their young. They don't have marked infanticide. It's true there are some things like cats, the males will kill a litter, that is not his, that he didn't make, and it will cause the female to go into heat. So there's a dominant male thing with some animals. But by and large, that was not true with the great apes. And the mothers breastfed their infants, and still do, many of them till their second molars. That's equivalent to 6 years old. And there is not significant infanticide. But amongst human women, infanticide has always been a major probability. In Russia today, there are more abortions than live births for the ethnic Russians. But yet it's projected by 2040, the Muslims will have a democratic majority because they have a birthing policy. As the Turkish general said for Europe, they do not need to take Europe by jihad. They will ride the democratic bus, or like in Gaza, that has made its population 15 times greater since the creation of Israel. The average age is in the teens, and they're being supported by the United Nations with housing and food. There's not a need for many to even work. The same thing has been in Chechnya, where there's so much money sent from Russia, like to rebuild Grozny. They had to import labor because there was too much freely given by the Moscow government to the citizens. That's another story. So back to this Garden of Eden. Females have had a mixed reaction to the male sex organ. But in the Garden of Eden story, that's the snake. They don't know whether to go along with it or to be against it. And the reality is, for 2 million years of human history and before, women have often been taken by violence and rape. The Harvard-backed studies of hunter-gatherers shows that up to 60% of the males died by violence. Now, violence came from big game. It came from defending the tribe, and it came from attacking other tribes to get their young women. But up to 60% of males died by violence. That means that near that percent often of women were the product, the mothers were the product of violent rape. So it's no wonder that with the development of logical ability, it happened with men first. They had to use logic to plan the hunt, to plan the fight, to plan the defense. The woman had the babies to take care of. That was her daily task and responsibility. It was the male responsibility to defend. That's why male humans developed right and left hemisphere specialization. And it's another reason why women suffer less from a stroke more often than men do, because women have essentially duplication of the two hemispheres of the cerebrum, where the male is one side logical dominant and then the other side nonverbal dominant. things like pattern intellect, music, and so forth. So men developed hemispheric specialization and developed 2 billion more brain cells. There's a definite distinction. The females that survived to pass on their genetics were the ones that were cared for by their mother. The ones that survived of the males were those that were socialized by the males to be able to work together and defend themselves. And after all these millions of years of women suffering violence and rape, they too developed logical language. And the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the women learning from the snake, the male penis, that the children were a product of the violence. So the male hatred that is genetic, because males are the ones who did the violence to the women that got pregnant and had babies. And after some millions of years, that becomes a genetic feature of survival. So women became aware that the child was a product of male penetration, which was associated with violent rape. And that is why there's a love-hate combination in women today. All these pitiful videos of praising motherhood because of the caring mother. But yet, they're willing to kill their babies. So often. That was the main, or one of the main causes for creating gods, was to sacrifice the children to them as if you're doing something that would please a god. But we'll get into that later. So in part 2, wandering boating tribes of hunter-gatherers, chiefs, shamans, and marauding bands. This is a continuation of the development spreading out by chasing game and by boating. And the chiefs and shamans were the dominant males, and they were supported by the females as a hedge against the males that dominated them. That process continued to today, especially in the worldly Christian churches that are now being emptied because women don't need the priests. They have the police on their side. They just need to call the police and have the man thrown out or take him to court, whatever. They don't need the priests, and the churches are emptying. In Europe, it's showing its effect now in America too. Well, this led to the dispersion of humans throughout the globe. And in the northern parts, there was mammoth hunting. Now, these mammoths were tons of meat. So in the process, they developed large boats and accumulated mammoth bones in their villages and built mammoth bone homes out of it. Evidence of that exists in the Don River Valley and other valleys there leading into the Black Sea. They learned to navigate by the stars because as the woolly mammoths became extinct, they had the white race had hunted woolly mammoths in North America. They're now finding bones that far predate the Indian or more Oriental people coming across the Bering Straits. But they hunted the mammoth to death and followed them back to Europe and Asia and continued hunting, but they had to travel hundreds and thousands of miles sometimes. And how could you go that far and get meat home without it being rotten? Not over land. If you're going to go a couple hundred or 1,000 miles on the Don River, you need a boat to get home in a hurry, comparatively to land, plus just the ability to haul tons of meat. And all this time spent at night observing the stars became a knowledge of how to sail by the stars. There was sailing out into the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, over into the Indian Ocean. And these early people set up megaliths that were a marking of their presence around the border, the coast of India and even Korea and Africa. And there's some argument that those on the islands were part of this. And there's evidence that they sailed to South America in the Indian War in later times. And evidence they were in America sailing the Great Lakes in later times. But this also led to a male culture of working together to sail the boats, to get the large game, to manage to get it home. Then came animal domestication, farming and ranching, and farm families. But not long after the taming of the horse, there came mounted marauding, rape, pillage, and plunder. That was provoked by the conflict between farming and ranching, which is from time immemorial. And the ranching ones, not having a fixed home, would just wander, and when they run across the farm, they would violate it. And they would take whatever they wanted. They developed the skill to attack because they were constantly under threat going into new territory. So they became the threat to the new territory. That made settled areas uncomfortable. And there was a welcome of conquest that brought protection. In China, we see that, and in Europe, the Persian, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Egyptian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. These empires were welcomed because they brought law and order. They were not fundamentally rape, pillage, and plunder marauding bands. They brought civilization and security. Just like in Jesus' days, it was safe to walk through areas now that you would be in danger of your life if you were caught carrying a Bible. Evidence that in Turkey, where the apostles went, in reference to those 3 men that were murdered brutally for printing Bibles in 2007. And it's part of the subterfuge of the Islamist Erdogan factions. They haven't, even though the men were caught at the scene where they horrifically murdered, tortured and murdered, they still haven't been brought to justice. And Erdogan used this to blame it on the generals and remove the generals that were secular to try and maintain a state with freedom of religion. But that's another point. So we had a welcome conquest that brought protection, but it also brought an affluent society. And this women not wanting to care for their children. It brought wet nurses and babysitters and destroyed the maternal nursing bond and the invention of gods to sacrifice their children to, like Moloch. Making your children pass through the fire was putting them into Moloch's arms where they would tumble down into the fire while the priests would beat on drums so you wouldn't hear the infants screaming as they were burned to death. That was true worldwide. Even today, a big charity in Karachi, Pakistan. No, there's you can find on YouTube, I believe it is, a video of a agency, not-for-profit agency, that goes around picking dead babies out of the garbage to give them a decent burial. And they find that 9 out of 10 of them are female. I'm not sure I understand that, but at any rate, where are we at here? The affluence leading to the affluent children brought up without a strong mammalian nursing bond that they could grow in caring, that they tended to be narcissistic and sadomasochistic sociopaths. And another chronic problem with the affluent is how to pass on the power of the family. If it was distributed to all the male children, it was degrading the power of the family. So there was often a culture of the eldest male inheriting the estate and the title or the family, which left these narcissistic, often sociopathic, manipulative children, other sons, from a power background, they became military officers and priests. And in this time, like in the Babylonian prehistoric civilizations that developed on the coast, and the invention of gods, that the mammoth hunters sailing, they knew how to sail by the stars. And when asked how do you go on the ocean, they explained they go by the stars. Well, that led to astrology and the creation of gods by these sociopaths that then set themselves up as priests. We understand the stars. We can tell your fortune. And here's these wandering stars. They must be more powerful. Oh, Mercury, the god of speed. Venus, the god of beauty. Mars, the god of war. And they made themselves priests to these gods. And then, of course, Abraham saw something else in that. But let's see, where are we at here? The military leaders became powerful. Then let's go to section 7, the Jewish contribution and Abraham. Abraham was the archetype in folk tales handed down as the father of the Jewish people that did not sacrifice his son. And he created a culture that child sacrifice was murder. It was not acceptable by Jehovah God. Jehovah God was the most high unseen God, not this Mars and Jupiter to move among the other gods, the unseen God. And that's not hard to understand. If you look where all of these, the planets and stars move around, there's a point called the North Pole, and there's nothing there. What an inspiration. The strongest God that everything moves with respect to, and there's nothing there. It's an unseen God. Abraham made this contribution. His father, as the Jewish lore says, was making idols that women would use for child sacrifice. The Jewish lore says that he then gave that practice up and followed his son. But so that created a culture where children were respected. What a wonderful contribution. But then the Hebrew people came out of Egypt, where Pharaoh had the power to kill at will. And Moses wrote down the 10 Commandments that even Pharaoh or some king was subject to. Nobody had the right to violate these laws. They were God's laws. They're not very highly supported by many. I know many that think there's nothing, that why make lying a sin? It's so common. Why have integrity? And so forth. But so that started the written heritage of the Jews, and to preserve this culture that would not sacrifice children. And it's recorded in Joshua, exterminated whole tribes that were doing child sacrifice and whole tribes that would sacrifice Jews. Killed them, men, women, and children, to make it a safe place to live and a safe place for children, that they would not be passed through the fire. And then they left some of them live, and they spread that culture, and even some of the Jews later got involved in it. You can read about that. But the way that the culture was preserved was by having the male children memorize the Torah. Now, the civilization of conquest, as we've already discussed, was corrupted by affluence. The wealthy, powerful women in powerful families hired wet nurses and babysitters, and their children ended up sadomasochistic, sociopathic, narcissistic, and in positions of power, which degraded that culture. From the top, it caved in with corruption. And that cycle happened over and over as one civilization decayed. The Babylonian civilization decayed, and the Egyptian civilization took over. And that decayed, and the Persian civilization took over. And that decayed, and the Greek civilization took over. And that decayed, and the Roman civilization took over. And then that decayed. But let's go back for a minute. And even in Jesus' day, and even today, the Orthodox Jews, memorization is the way that culture was preserved for over 3,000 years. For over 2,000 years, no country. In 1948, a country, and all of a sudden there's a nation. The nation was preserved by making robots out of children having memorized what another person said or memorize what another person wrote. That's the way that sanctified means set aside, not a child sacrificing culture, was preserved. During the periods of law and order, both throughout Asia and Europe, a wonderful thing happened. Farm families developed under the protection of law and order. And the thing about a farm family is it supported the mammalian nursing bond. It valued children. They were what would take care of the elders later on, and they were part of the family. Anybody that's raised children and spent time with them, growing up, children want to help. They want to be part of the family. That's what's missing today. They're raised with television and daycare. They're not part of the family. It's not a family organization anymore. And the nursing bond is gone. They're fortunate if they're not autistic. But along with the law and order and the law of Moses, Moses had established a priesthood that the annual sacrifice would take place, and that people would go to the priest, and there was the Holy of Holies that only the priest could go behind with this sacrifice and go behind for the sins of the people. The people had to go to the priest. The priest went to God for them. And along comes this man born with an outlook that he is part of God. God is his Father, and he can communicate with him directly. And he's willing to stand up. He says things like, greater love hath no man that he give his life for his friends. And here's these priests that are separating him from his God, Father God, and separating all of the people. And he feels that fellowship, that oneness with God. As later Paul would say, in him we live and move and have our being. He was part of God. And not only that, he had that knowledge, the spirit, the outlook, that he is part of God. The first born with this eternal truth. The first living human with this eternal spirit outlook. And he taught not just that you have direct fellowship with God, but that the sacrifice that he will have to make is valuable because he will help send another outlook, the spirit of truth. That is scientific truth, not the so-called science of this world, which is built on goofiness many times, like the social sciences that justify whatever women's liberation wants. And I remember Mabel White told me, NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, that's really the parents who want to be able to drug and shock and lobotomize their children, and that's the parents and the doctors behind this organization. And come to find out, they fight for the right to take away children's rights and lock them up, have them shocked, have them drugged, and the doctors, that's their living. At any rate, this abortion isn't the only way to get rid of your child. That's a whole nother thing. What I wanted to make clear is the effect of the family farm on raising the children with love, with that bond, maternal bond and paternal respect, the father, the strong man of the family farm, and you find this ability to respect others, to respect elders and pass on the wisdom of the elders. You find it in China, and the peaceful, loving outlook flourished, whether you called it Buddhism or whether you called it Christianity. But Christianity gave it a source of an outlook that is directly in relationship with a living God, which is all of us. In God we live and move and have our being. We're like living cells in a living body. And this man, Jesus, brought that, and it flourished in family farming areas, whether in Europe or in America. The thing that happened that corrupted Europe was feudalism. The Roman Empire broke down, and there were warlords fighting amongst each other, and they set up these feudal states where they said, we own the property and you're our feudal possession, and you have to pay rent. Many of them continued in their personal religion, but the Catholic Church got involved with feudalism, and the feudal lords, their children were corrupt just like the Roman Empire. The affluent got babysitters and wet nurses and passed on their power to their children. The oldest male becoming the lord of the family, and the other males becoming priests and military officers, and many of them sociopathic, sadomasochistic, narcissistic. Look at me dance, look at my clothes, look at my hair. Oh, this is the Renaissance. Look at me, look at me. And underneath were all these family farmers suffering and loving the Lord, believing that they were part of God in the spirit of truth, the outlook of caring for yourself, for your mate, for your children, for your community, for society, for the future, and to serve this as a part of a living being that is eternal. At any rate, they had to get out. A lot of them come to America. This Renaissance, it was really the Dark Ages, was when the Bible was kept from them. Wherever the Bible come out, there's this, amongst the farm families, this home churches flourished. The Bible, in its simplicity, not with a priesthood, but with families getting together and sharing the insights of caring and the teaching to help the future. Of course, it gets lost in modern society with daycare for everybody, and women don't have to get married, so the children have no father. And the reality is, the male behavior and fathering that grew out of largely the Norse country, where they had to work together in the mammoth hunting and boating, it is mainly cultural. It's not genetic. It takes a father who has been raised in that culture to raise a son in the care and admonition and respect for the gift of life. All right, let's get back to then. Developed the capacity for altruistic caring in mainly farm families and those with a healthy background. This altruistic ability is common in farm family areas, whether where the Buddhism flourished in China and India and other places before Islam exterminated it, like in Afghanistan, where they blew up the age-old statues carved into the mountain of Buddha to show their contempt for Buddhism. But also Christianity spread among farm families. And it spread among those who were fortunate enough to be raised in a healthy, loving relationship, that they were brought up in the care and admonition of good values. And they grew to care for others and to care for the future. But what happened then? Christianity was founded on the idea of caring and responsibility, confronting evil even if it kills you, protecting your home, your community, of course. But it was taken over by a genetic disposition. On the one side, the genetic disposition of dominant male, which is part of male genetic heritage, and the manipulative female, which is part of, and male hatred, which is part of the female genetic heritage. And so there were home churches founded, and everybody had their place. The women learned from hearing what the men had to say and talking and sharing their point of view with their husband privately. But all the men and women had prayer and hymns and dominant male. You can read about it in John's epistle. Dominant male taking over and wouldn't allow the 2-by-2 servants come to the meeting in their home. And then setting up a priesthood again that the women could use to manipulate and the men could use to claim dominance and control, corrupting Christianity from what Jesus gave us. And then we have Muhammad, from a marauding background, justified with a new god, Allah, and as a camel driver for desert caravans, he learned Judaism and Christianity, including the false books like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, because he believed Jesus made mud birds and flew on them and they flew away, and it's in the Quran twice. But he saw and understood from his own Arab background the memorization was important, and how the indoctrination with the God that gave them permission to do what they wanted to do was his taking over of Jehovah God to Allah, that he was justified in rape, pillage, and plunder of non-believers and polytheists. And it still goes on today. That's the male dominant Islamo-fascist theocracy. And I just felt so sad when I learned after the killings that I had to be so close to. I bought my brother-in-law, I didn't buy it, I lent him $8,000 towards a used Mercedes tourist bus that he would drive from Minvadi to Elbrus. Elbrus is the tallest mountain in Europe, and I've been there. My brother-in-law took me there, me and my wife and others, to go. In the summertime, you get on a ski lift and there's no snow except way up high, but you don't go up to the snow. You go up to the mountain hanging in the middle of air. Beautiful scenery, a stream underneath, and you go up to a nice restaurant. It's a wonderful, wonderful tourist attraction. And he was driving minibus there. Well, he bought this used Mercedes-Benz. Had a toilet in it, and I think it's seated 54. But here, this is 2013. It was, I guess, now 3 or 4 years ago, the Muslims attacked a minibus and killed the driver and 9 people. Went to Elbrus, blew up the ski lift, and then went to Nelchik and killed, I think it was 6 or 9 policemen. They didn't want the corruption of non-Muslim people coming there. That's the reality. And 2 of the planes in Siberia Airlines that fly south from Moscow, blown up by women with bombs in their burqas. And another suicide bomber killing, I think it was 90 in Domodedovo Airport. That was, I think, 2 years ago. Blowing up churches, killing all the time, killing peaceful imams. But anyway, that was counterbalanced. That's the male genetic foundation of wanting to be a dominant male. And the female genetic foundation, and combined with the male, has expressed itself in modern day Christianity in many cases, with the priests, the rise of the priesthood and the worship of women. And aside from religion, although in South America the socialism women's agenda is very high in the Catholic Church. There's some nuns pushing for socialism that in Buffalo, New York, they had a home on Main Street that was part of their charity and used for collecting money for South America mainly. But without religion, many narcissistic rejected religion, and many Jews rejected Judaism. You could do that. The Muslims, it's the death penalty. The Jews are just denounced by their family. But they have the communist revolution. Well, like in Russia today, the men don't live old enough to retire at 65, but the women can retire at 55. And very few have a husband living with them. The men are not respected. We have home church ministers. One of them, a woman from Kazakhstan, said she has difficulty preaching Father God in Russia because there's so little respect for males. And it's true. You see them laying in the street drunk, bloody from falling on their head or being beaten up. And so many boys raised without a father, so many stuck in orphanages and autistic, banging their heads on the walls. And not another story, the degradation of socialism. It's a women's liberation dream. And now Obama wants earlier child care. Claims it'll be better education. And in my home area in New York, there's a sign now posted for children in daycare at 6 weeks old. And we wonder why autism has gone from 1 in 1,700 to 1 in something like 55 now for boys. It's even worse in South Korea, where the daycare is stronger. The women are all working very early. By the way, they have, a little country has the 15th largest economy, but they have the highest suicide rate in the world. It wasn't like that before the Korean War and industrialization and women out of the home. And amongst the Amish, that where the mother has been raised in the care of her farm family, the autism rate is still low. That's another thing. Raising a healthy future based on knowledge of genetics and child development. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Respecting the rights of new life to a healthy planned conception by a married mother and father with a healthy single family home. A mother able to give a mammalian nursing bond, keeping a healthy home, showing care and respect for the role of a providing, protecting, and caring father. We could use our brain to do this. We are intelligence besides genetics. And my operational definition of God is everything. Nothing outside of God. I believe that basic matter, space, and motion are eternal, not created, not destroyed. The capacity for motion. that creation is forming something like creating a hat or molding clay. We are formed out of God's dirt. And I've done some work in physics. We swim in a background of ether that has been rejected. There's so much ignorance at the university that that's a whole nother thing. Not just in the social sciences, but in physics too. And many can't distinguish imaginary worlds from reality, especially mathematicians, and theoretical physicists. But how do I end this? This idea of God is everything, and God's laws. We learn them, as Paul said, in him we live and move and have our being. God's laws are what children need to learn from experience. How to throw a ball, the laws of a spring, the laws of the flight of a ball, the laws of chemistry, the laws of physics. These are God's laws, and we need to learn God's laws of reasonably guaranteeing a healthy, caring future where the individual can go from caring for self to caring for others like self, homoerotic, to caring for others not like self, heteroerotic. You need a foundation to get there, to move beyond the caring for the others of the opposite sex, to be able to join and care unselfishly for a child who can't do anything but take perfectly good food and turn it into a diaper change. And he goes, and you run around and try to take care of it. If you have the ability to care, and if you have the supports of a working, caring, mutual relationship, and that the two of them are important, is because if something tragic happens, you're not alone. God doesn't leave you alone. God is in us. And where two or more are gathered, that spirit is there. A man and a wife need each other in a caring ability to care for their child, to care for the world that the child is growing into. And we need to choose our leaders by those that have proven, by their children and grandchildren, that there's something they understand. Not a university degree or this or that. Healthy, caring grandchildren and children. And the man and wife with the man as the spokesman, having positions of responsibility and authority for the justice system, for the political system. That's my hope for the future. I'm doing my best to provide a reasonably articulate foundation, which I share openly. I make no money for it. I thank everyone that has contributed, and you can take and revise it. If you have insights that are better to share in the future, be my guest. My hope is that my work will help some, whether building on it or seeing errors and revising it to build. That is my introduction to Part 1, Section 34. Thank you.